please, as we begin our plenary session this morning, I would ask those who are toward the back to please move forward. As you know, many of you are preachers, you know it feels much better to have the audience closer to you, so please move forward if you would to fill in more of the rows forward. I'll give you a minute to do that. Thank you, and good morning. It's my privilege to welcome you to our morning plenary convocation lecture, Radically Rethinking Black Theologies of Emancipatory Justice, Militant Reconciling Love, Race, Gender, and Economics. Our plenary speaker for today is the Reverend Canon Kelly Brown Douglas. She is the inaugural dean of the Episcopal Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary. Prior to going to Union, Dr. Douglas was a Susan D. Morgan Distinguished Professor of Religion at Goucher College and the Canon Theologian at Washington National Cathedral. She also served for us here as Associate Professor of Theology from 1987 to 2001, and Assistant Professor of Religion at Edward Waters College before that, 1986 to 87. Dr. Douglas is a leading voice in the development of womanist theology. She's widely published in national and international journals and several books and other publications. Her books are groundbreaking and widely used, such as Sexuality and the Black Church, A Womanist Perspective. Her latest book, Stand Your Ground, Black Bodies and the Justice of God, examines the deep roots of stand your ground culture in America and the challenges that this brings for the Black church community. She's a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Denison College, where she earned a Bachelor of Science, summa cum laude in psychology, earned a Master's of Divinity and a doctoral degree in systematic theology from Union Theological Seminary. We are very, very pleased to have Dr. Douglas back home again, and let's give her a hand. As Dr. Douglas gets ready to speak, I want to introduce our respondents. They are Reverend Renee Harrison. She is Associate Professor of African American and American Religious History in the School of Divinity, where she has served since 2010. She's author of Enslaved Women and the Art of Resistance in Antebellum America, and her research continues in regards to interdisciplinary interfaith approaches to African American religious history and culture. We also have the Right Reverend Oscar Brown, who is pastor of First Mount Olive Free Will Baptist Church. Under his leadership, Mount Olive's membership Rehoboth campus in Linthicum, Maryland, has increased from 500 members to over 2,500. He has birthed at least 23 additional life-changing ministries throughout his time at First Mount Olive. And we are also happy to have one of our third-year students, Joe Harris, as a third respondent. After Dr. Douglas speaks, then our respondents will each have 10 to 12 minutes to respond. Dr. Douglas.
Thank you. Good morning. It is indeed a pleasure to be back here at Howard University School of Divinity, a place I do consider home. It was Dean Lawrence Jones who I will always holds a very special place, not simply in my heart, but in my life's journey and in my theological journey, as he truly gave me my first opportunity to serve as a theologian in the divinity school as he brought me here very early on in my theological journey. And I indeed completed my doctoral dissertation while I was here at Howard University School of Divinity. And so coming back here is special indeed, where I see old friends and colleagues. And of course, I am so honored to share this time with the respondents and my more than good friend, but my brother, Ron Hopson. It's also just a privilege to be here for the convocation in which my friend and colleague Yolanda Pierce will be installed as your first female dean. I know without question that this community is blessed by her presence. She will indeed lead you into new frontiers in providing and nurturing and fostering leadership, ministerial leadership for the world that we have. You called her not because she's a woman. You called her to this place because she is indeed the leader that is right for this divinity school at this time. So I am just so pleased to be able to be here and share in some small way in this moment with my friend, Yolanda Pierce. But let me move forward with the talk for today as we celebrate this convocation and looking at new ways of doing theology. And before I begin, and because I take it for granted and shouldn't be taken for granted, and I don't take for granted, that I especially want to thank, of course, Dr. Courtwright Davis. And yes. He's not old enough to be my father. I'm not young enough to be his daughter, but I tell you, age aside, he is my friend, my colleague, and much more than that, my theological mentor, and just is the anchor in my life. And since I met him the day I walked onto this campus, and he has been supportive of me ever since, and has pushed me in ways that I would have never believed I could go in terms of my ministry as a priest in the Episcopal Church, and certainly in terms of my theology. And I don't see him right now, but I know he's out there somewhere, and so I can't continue without just acknowledging that and saying thank you. And so now let me begin. In November 1957, the Howard University School of Religion's convocation theme was nonviolence and social change. A young Martin Luther King Jr. provided the closing convocation sermon entitled, "Love Your Enemies." That conference reflected the Howard School of Theology's defining theology at that time, a theology it called militant reconciling love. This theology signaled the school's mission to, quote, unquote, articulate a Christian way in race relations as it equipped African American ministerial leadership with a theoretical and tactical foundation, end quote, to attack the Jim Crow manifestation of white supremacist racism of that day. 60 years later, the Howard University School of Divinity continues the legacy of its 1957 convocation, not only in its chosen theme, but also as it continues to reflect theologically upon white supremacist racism as it manifests itself in the 21st century. In this time for us, I have chosen to enter this conversation through echoing the 1957 theme as I engage the topic, More Than Skin Deep, the violence of anti-Blackness and its implications for Black theological thought, highlighting the meaning of militant reconciling love in this regard. In a 1967 speech defending Black protesters' rights to use violence to rid ourselves of oppression, as Jamal Abdullah Al-Amin, then known as H. Rap Brown, said, he continued that violence is a part of Americans' culture. It is, he said, as American as cherry pie. While Al-Amin's words received much criticism at that time, he actually spoke a truth about America, especially when it comes to the Black body, that perhaps he did not even fully grasp. For the violence to which Black bodies fall prey in America reflects an often ignored narrative that is integral to America's very violent identity, an identity which indeed fosters the violent culture to which Al-Amin points. It is the violence that is the narrative of anti-Blackness. It is to this narrative that I will now turn, so to understand the violence to which Al-Amin speaks and to discern the meaning for Black theological reflection in militant reconciling love. The narrative of anti-Blackness became most palpable with Europeans' earliest incursions into the African continent. While ancient Greek and Roman scholars were certainly a chauvinistic people when it came to their appraisal of their own people's body aesthetic, there was little evidence that color prejudice was integral in their thought or culture. Even as the Greeks described the Africans as burnt people, this description did not imply a stigma of color. Rather, it pointed to their belief concerning the impact living close to the sun had on a people's pigmentation. In the main, the reality of color prejudice is of Western origination, coming into full relief with the earliest European encounters with Africa. While the belief that Africans were meant to be slaves was prevalent prior to European encroachments upon the African continent, an anti-Black narrative was not as apparent until their arrival. For as historian Winthrop Jordan says, one of the fairest-skinned nations, the English, suddenly came face to face with one of the darkest peoples on the earth, end quote. The color difference was so arresting that these early European explorers of Africa made little of African people's diverse skin tones. Instead, they typically described them as all Black. Whether describing Africans as Black was initially done with purposeful, malicious intent is debatable. What is clear is that skin color mattered to the Europeans in their encounters with a people seemingly starkly different from themselves. Furthermore, Black was not a benign signifier. No less an authority than the Oxford English Dictionary had already established whiteness as a sign of innocence, purity, and goodness, while Blackness signified vileness, danger, and evil. As far apart as the English complexion was from the African, the meaning of whiteness was from Blackness, signaling the foundation of an antagonistic oppositionality that has lethal consequences even today. Essentially, to describe the Africans as Black ensured that the Eurocentric color-defined gaze would not remain innocent, if it ever was. It was only the beginning of an anti-Blackness that provided the aesthetic justification for the enslavement and other violent acts against the bodies of Black women and men. As crucial as skin color was, it was not the only physical feature that astonished these early white intruders and soon to be pillagers of Africa's human and other sacred resources, and thus not the only aspect of the anti-Black narrative. Europeans also noted with ominous condescension the fullness of the Africans' lips, the broadness of their noses, and the texture of their hair. It soon became very clear that there was more at play than just a shocked realization of how diverse human creation was. In the European imagination, the African's physiognomy signaled a genetic difference. When coupled with the dissimilarity of dress and customs, not to speak of religions, the European interlopers became convinced that the blackness of the Africans was more than skin deep. They believed it penetrated through to their very character and soul, which some Europeans claimed Africans did not possess, thereby signaling a people who were so thoroughly uncivilized that they were more beastly than human. That Africans were likened to beasts was consequential. This beastly descriptor implied not simply that they were wild and uncivilized, but also hypersexualized. As Jordan explains, the terms bestial and beastly carried with them sexual connotations. Thus, when an Englishman described the Africans as beastly, he, quoting Jordan, was frequently as much registering a sense of sexual shock as describing swinish manners, end quote. The similarities that the Europeans registered between the Africans and the apes, more specifically orangutans, gave way to further insinuations concerning the Africans' sexual habits. The unfortunate circumstance was that the Europeans' first encounter with the orangutans coincided with their first encounters with the people of Africa. Hence, they were just as startled by these animal similarities to humans as they were by what they considered the Africans' subhuman qualities. It required, therefore, a small leap in the European imagination to conceive of an inherent connection between African apes and African people, as well as a beastly copulation or conjuncture between the two species, as Jordan observes. It was in this way that blackness came to signal a people who were grossly uncivilized and dangerously hypersexualized. Philosopher Richard Girard's observations concerning the connection between sexuality and violence are instructive. Girard describes sex and violence as different sides of the same coin. He explains that sexual excitement and violent impulses elicit identical bodily reactions. He goes on to say, thwarted sexuality leads naturally to violence. That the early European encroachers onto the African continent posited a sexual connection between wild animals and uncivilized Africans only fortified the notion that African women and men were violently dangerous. If nothing else, it was clear to the white interlopers that these were a people who needed to be patrolled and controlled, given their desolate character and beastly disposition. The violent nature of the anti-black narrative itself now becomes clear. It is about more than a chauvinistic repulsion to skin color or cultural differences. It is a narrative that negates the very humanity of a people, therefore making it inherently violent. We must be clear that any ideology or system of thought that objectifies another human being is violent, whether or not it is accompanied by physical harm, though most often they are. Borrowing from the words of Paulo Freire, that which fails to recognize others as persons, hence dehumanizes them, is by definition violent. Furthermore, such a system of thought initiates a cycle of violence in which the oppressed, in this instance black bodies, become entrapped. As Paulo Freire explains, there would be no oppressed had there been no prior situation of violence to establish their subjugation. The prior situation which makes black bodies oppressed bodies is the narrative of anti-blackness. It is in this way that Freire is also right to say that the oppressed are never the initiators of violence. In short, you hear that? In short, the narrative of anti-blackness spawns a multi-dimensional cycle of violence against black bodies. This brings us to the centrality of this narrative to the American identity. The anti-black narrative arrived in America with the Puritans and Pilgrims. When America's Pilgrim and Puritan forebears fled England in search of freedom, they believed themselves descendants of an ancient Anglo-Saxon people, free from the taint of intermarriages, who seemingly to them possessed high moral values and an instinctive love for freedom. Their beliefs reflected an Anglo-Saxon myth, instigated by the first-century Roman philosopher Tacitus, who in his book touted the unique superiority of these Anglo-Saxon people from the ancient woods of Germany. Fueled by this myth, Americans crossed the Atlantic with a vision to build a nation that was politically, culturally, if not demographically true to their exceptional Anglo-Saxon heritage. As such, America was envisioned as a testament to the sacredness of Anglo-Saxon character and values, if not people. American exceptionalism was Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism. In this regard, to be an American, to be an Anglo-Saxon rather, was the measure of what it meant to be an American. American identity from the very beginning was equated with Anglo-Saxon identity. In order to safeguard America's mythic Anglo-Saxon vision and sense of self, a pervasive culture of whiteness was born. The point of the matter was that whiteness became the perfect way to mask the fact that America was an immigrant nation with migrants, even from Europe, who were not actually Anglo-Saxon. The elevation of whiteness was inevitable, since, as I noted earlier, whiteness had come to signify purity and moral innocence, a skin tone therefore befitting exceptional Anglo-Saxons. Invariably, therefore, whiteness forged an impregnable wall between America's myth of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism and that which might compromise it, such as those persons on the other side of whiteness. Hence, white culture, with an anti-black narrative as its defining core feature, was born. For there was nothing that opposed whiteness more than blackness, not only in color, but also in what it signified about a people. To reiterate, blackness signified a lewd, dangerous, and immoral people, while whiteness signaled a chaste, innocent, and virtuous people. In the words of legal scholar Cheryl Harris, quote, "The amalgamation of various European strains into an American identity, that is Anglo-Saxon identity, was facilitated by an oppositional definition of black as other," end quote. It is this oppositionality between whiteness and blackness that forms the basis of white supremacist ideology. With the emergence of a white supremacist ideology, two things become clear. First, perhaps stating the obvious, the ideology of white supremacy depends upon the narrative of anti-blackness, since the notion of white superiority, rests on the ideal of black inferiority in particular and a denigrating oppositionality in general. Second, whiteness itself must be regarded as a violent identity construct, in as much as it is defined in denigrating opposition to that which is non-white, notably blackness. This brings us back to the fact of white culture. White culture, in its various manifestations, is that which perpetuates the ideal of white superiority, especially through its legal and extra-legal expressions, and it helps whiteness to stand its ground against any corrupting or threatening intrusion into the Anglo-Saxon, that is, white space, like black bodies. And so once again, the reality of America's inherent violence becomes evident. For like white identity, White culture in all of its expressions is intrinsically violent, given its necessary anti-black nature. The point of the matter is that as long as American identity is grounded in the myth of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism, and it is, then it is a violent identity. In this regard, there's no getting around it. Anti-black violence is in America's DNA. Now, before exploring this further in terms of its 21st century realities and theological implications, it is important to note the particular impact of the anti-black narrative on black women's bodies. As grave an impact that the European anti-black gaze had on black people in general, it had a unique bearing upon black women. For this gaze was not only shaped by color, but also by gender. Thus, it involved a racialized standard of beauty that indicated whether or not one was a proper woman. The visage of a beautiful woman in the English mind was well established during the Elizabethan period, with the Queen serving as the perfect exemplar of it. Once again, this aesthetic assessment was not benign, especially when it came to black women in America, given the enslaved realities of their lives compared to the realities of white women's lives. As far away as black women were from the standard of white beauty, they were also from the norms of living in life in terms of what it meant to be a lady. As is well documented, black women became the perfect foil to white women. While white women were considered virginal, pure angels in need of protection, white women were considered lascivious Jezebels in need of controlling. To reiterate an earlier point, according to early European logic, the black African women were so lewd that even the African apes were sexually drawn to them. Black women were essentially entrapped within the catch-22 of a violent intersection. For inasmuch as they did not meet the white female standard of beauty, they were not regarded as ladies to be respected. The more that their black skin engulfed and entrapped them in a life condition that defied ideal womanhood, then more validity was given to the meaning of their black body aesthetic. Their blackness signified that they were in fact not proper ladies, even as it ensured that they would never enjoy the privilege of being treated as a lady. And worse yet, it ensured brutal assaults against their bodies, oftentimes with moral and legal impunity. In short, the narrative of anti-blackness itself is violent. It therefore spawns a cycle of violence with fatal results for black bodies. Worse yet, this violent narrative is integral to America's very identity. And so it seems that not only is violence in general as American as apple cherry pie, but so too is violence against black bodies. Now let me just say a word about how this is manifest today before we look at the theological implications. That black bodies bear the brunt of America's war on drugs, biased policing, and tough on crime measures is well documented. However, what is not so well documented and often unrecognized is the fact that these assaults upon black bodies reflect the unspoken violence of the anti-black narrative that is woven into the fabric of America's mythic Anglo-Saxon identity and its day-to-day impact on black lives. It is this anti-black narrative that ensures that African Americans are 5.1 more likely than whites to be incarcerated, resulting in the fact that while black people make up around 13.2% of the U.S. population, they account for almost 40% of prison population. An even more disconcerting manifestation of the anti-black narrative is its impact on young black bodies, thus assuring what has become known as a school-to-prison pipeline. This pipeline is evident in the racially disproportionate rates of school suspensions and juvenile sentencing. According to recent Department of Education data, black males are 3 times more likely than their white counterparts to be suspended from school, while black girls are 6 times more likely than their white counterparts, perhaps reflecting the intersecting realities of race and gender inherent in the narrative of anti-Blackness. In fact, a recent study by Georgetown Law's Center on Poverty and Inequality found that adults view Black girls as less innocent and more adult-like than their white peers, especially in the age range of 5 to 14, perhaps accounting for the fact that Black girls are disciplined much more often and much more severely than their white peers, both in schools and within the juvenile justice system. It is interesting to note that this study brings attention to the criminalization of Black girls is taking place much earlier than that for Black boys, who are often viewed as older and criminalized by the age of 10. Both bad narratives. The anti-Black narrative is also realized through socioeconomic policies, which trap over 27% of Black bodies in a cycle of poverty, rendering Black children 4 times more likely than their white or Asian counterparts and significantly more likely than Hispanic children to be likewise trapped. In short, because of the violent anti-Black narrative that helps to define America's identity, Black bodies are trapped in a cycle of violence, from poverty to incarceration to death. In fact, given the violent culture of poverty, which as far as I am concerned is best understood as a culture of death, the high rate of gun violence and hence Black-on-Black gun homicides, which are often talked about, should come of no surprise. Indeed, what should be more surprising are the numbers of Black persons that are able to survive and thrive with dignity in conditions that indeed intend their death, not the abundant life in which God promises us all. With that said, I would be remiss not to say a word about our Make America Great Again reality of Donald Trump. There is no escaping the fact that Donald Trump's vision to make America great again is essentially a 21st century manifestation of America's Anglo-Saxon exceptionalist myth, again, the culture of white supremacy, with its concomitant narrative of anti-Blackness that protects it. His mantra of greatness is more than a dog whistle. Rather, it is a clarion call to action for those who have clung tightly to the Anglo-Saxon white vision of America. And of course, no one made this clearer than past imperial wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, than David Duke, when he said, and I quote him, "We are determined to take our country back. We are going to fulfill the promises of Donald Trump. That's what we believed in. That's why we voted for Donald Trump, because he said he's going to take our country back. And that's what we got to do," end quote. In this regard, just as the Unite the Right rally, as we saw in Charlottesville, should come as no surprise, neither should President Trump's refusal to unapologetically and unambiguously denounce the violence that is white supremacy and religious bigotry. Far from rejecting the white supremacist anti-Black groups and their violent ideologies, Trump has only emboldened them with wall-building, law and order, and nationalistic immigration policies, along with a protectionist brand of patriotism that plays into the bigoted fears and stereotypes that fuel white supremacy and anti-Blackness. We must be clear. The politics of Donald Trump reflect the inherent danger of America's defining Anglo-Saxon myth. When it expresses itself, it makes people the problem. Hence, to make America great again is to take back the country from the problem people. That is, those who are on the other side of America's myth of Anglo-Saxon white identity. So again, it is no wonder that we are witnessing a resurgence of bigoted violence, or for that matter, presidential rants and calls for bans, orders, and policies that prevent certain peoples from enjoying the full rights and privileges of citizenship. But as disturbing and as the blatant white supremacist anti-Black policies of Trump are, We must recognize that something perhaps even more insidious has occurred when it comes to the narrative of anti-blackness and white supremacy in this country. This narrative of anti-blackness has insinuated itself into the collective American consciousness of this nation, and consequently, it has successfully implanted itself deep within the psyche of the American people, and in so doing is implanted within that psyche the image of the black body in particular and non-white bodies in general as a dangerously criminal body and an ever-present threat to whiteness. Numerous studies show this to be the case. They reveal that when white people in particular see a black body, they see a criminal. Indeed, these studies reveal an almost automatic, unconscious response to black bodies, as if those bodies are threatening or criminal in and of themselves. In this same line, there are various other ways in which a narrative of anti-blackness shows up, such as in white America's responses to protests. According to a recent survey conducted by the Public Religion Research Institute, 67% of white Americans believe protesting against the government's unfair practices are good for the nation. However, when asked the same question, but specifically about protests led by black people, well, that number drops to 48%. The point of the matter is that as long as the violent narrative of anti-blackness is a decisive and defining aspect of America's Anglo-Saxon identity, then black bodies will be denounced, demeaned, and disproportionately impacted by denigrating and deadly violence, and of course, will never be given the full privileges of citizenship, let alone the respect for being human. To reiterate, the narrative of anti-blackness is violent, as its sole purpose is the denigration and dehumanization of people, and of black people and other peoples that are not white enough. For it is important to note that while the starkness of this narrative is played out on the black body and defined in relationship to it, other peoples who threaten notions of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalist character, i.e. immigrants, LGBTQ people, women, are colored by the black brush, so to speak, as this narrative is at once patriarchal, as we saw in regard to black women, heterosexist, xenophobic, and Christian-centered. And so, what are we to do about it? It is here where Jesus' crucifying death and resurrection speaks to our situation. The cross represents the power that denigrates human bodies, destroys life, and preys on the most vulnerable in society. As the cross is defeated, so too is that crucifying power. The striking factor is how it is defeated. It is defeated by a nonviolent, life-affirming force that is none other than God's resurrection of Jesus. It cannot be stressed enough that God's resurrecting power is one that by definition respects the sacred integrity of all human bodies and the sanctity of all life. This is significant in two ways as we reflect upon the violence that violates black lives. Black feminist literary artist and social critic Audre Lorde once said, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game," she says, "but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change," end quote. What the crucifixion resurrection event reveals is that God does not use the master's tools. God does not utilize the violence exhibited in the cross to defeat deadly violence itself. As Lorde suggests, while such violence may bring a temporary solution, it does not bring an end to the culture of deadly violence itself. Rather, one stays entrapped in that very culture. As such, to quote Lorde, only the most narrow parameters of change are possible and allowable, end quote. This implies, therefore, that the only way to defeat violent power is with nonviolent means. There is no doubt that the cross reflects the depth and scope of human violence. The cross, in this respect, represents the consuming violence of the world and of our nation. It points to a world and nation that is saturated with violence. Always remember that this violence includes not simply the physical brutality meant to harm and destroy bodies, but also the systems, structures, narratives, and constructs that also are meant to harm and destroy bodies. Such, again, is the narrative of anti-Blackness and the systems and structures it fosters in conjunction with white supremacy. It cannot be said enough. And if you don't remember anything else, remember this, that anything that would devalue the life of another is violent. Through Jesus Christ, God enters into this world of violence, yet does not take it in to God's very self. Thus, God responds to the violence of the world, not in an eye-for-eye manner. Instead, God responds in a way that negates and denounces the violence that perverts and demeans the integrity of human lives. God accomplishes this by affirming life, as seen in the very resurrection of Jesus. Essentially, God responds to the violence of the cross, the violence of the world, in a nonviolent but forceful manner. No one recognized the power of nonviolence to break the cycle of violence more than Martin Luther King Jr. He said, quote, "Violence ultimately destroys everybody." King could not adopt the eye-for-eye philosophy. He said, because it ends up leaving everybody blind. It is important to understand that nonviolence, however, is not the same as passivity or accommodation to violence. Rather, it is a forceful, if not belligerent, response that protects the integrity of life. This is even clearer if we recognize that Jesus was crucified in the first place because of his active resistance to the violent political and religious powers and structures of his day, which trapped various peoples in violent, hence crucifying, realities of living. This is what is best described, perhaps, as a militant love. It is a love that takes on that which would violate and betray the sacred humanity and dignity of another. The point is that while violence seeks to denigrate and do harm to the bodies of people, nonviolence reflects, if you will, the militant love of Jesus as it seeks to free bodies from denigrating and deadly violence, regardless of who's perpetuating it. By not resorting to violence, it seeks to break the cycle of violence itself. In this regard, the crucifixion-resurrection event reflects nothing less than a counter-narrative to crucifying narratives of violence, like anti-Blackness. Now, I'm winding down. This has implications for breaking the cycle of violence perpetuated by the narratives of anti-Blackness and white supremacy, and of course, further theological implications. Even as people must consistently resist and dismantle the systems and structures of anti-Black violence that serves to protect the myth of Anglo-Saxon white exceptionalism, to counter the narrative to anti-Blackness, there is something just as essential. That is an actual counter-narrative that boldly affirms the value of Black bodies. These narratives must disrupt the collective consciousness of America, especially white America, if Black bodies are ever to be truly free from the various violent manifestations of America's anti-Blackness and white supremacist narratives. In this regard, the refrain, "Black Lives Matter," is just as significant as the movement's active protests against the systemic and structural violence perpetrated against Black bodies. For the refrain itself offers a direct counter-narrative to a narrative of anti-Blackness as it loudly affirms the sacred value of Black lives. With this being the case, it was inevitable that as the Black Lives Matter hashtag went viral and as it moved onto the public square, whiteness would stand its ground with the refrain that all lives matter. Essentially, this latter refrain was nothing less than an utter refusal to acknowledge the value of Black lives, and thus an utter refusal to reject the narrative of anti-Blackness. So in the end, it is essential that the Black Lives Matter refrain be consistently repeated on the public square if it is ever to counteract the hold that the narrative of anti-Blackness has on the white American psyche. Let me now say something more about this narrative of anti-Blackness and its implications for Black theologies. Even as it has become a part of America's white collective consciousness, that is the anti-Black narrative, it is also manifest within the collective Black psyche and community. There are, of course, the most obvious ways in which this is the case, that we unconsciously take in the very stereotypes and caricatures of Black bodies, as do others. We see this, for instance, in the reality of colorism that has long been a part of the Black community. We see this as well in our own responses to Black bodies, let alone our sense of self. It is for this reason that James Baldwin wrote in 1964, in quote, "Every Negro mother and father has had to face their child and try to create in that child some sense of surviving this particular world and some way to make the child who will be despised not despise himself." It is for this reason that Audre Lorde also says, "Raising Black children, female and male, in the mouth of a racist, sexist, suicidal dragon is perilous and chancy. If they cannot resist and love at the same time, they will probably not survive." End quote. It is for this reason, therefore, that Black theologies must always emphasize that Black people are created in the image of a free God. Thus, Black people are sacred beings created to be free. For as Howard Thurman reminds us, to know this, he says, is to be able to transcend the vicissitudes of life, however terrifying, end quote. To instill this connection to a God that is free, and to provide this counter-narrative to the narratives of anti-Blackness is again a manifestation of a militant love, as it is the resolve to love yourself fiercely, regardless. But there is an even more blatant, yet unacknowledged way in which the Black community, and indeed Black theologies, have promoted anti-Black narratives, namely in regard to LGBTQ persons. For as implied earlier, LGBTQ persons are regarded in the narrative of anti-Blackness, are regarded painted by the narrative, rather, of anti-Blackness. Thus, they are considered hypersexualized, more beastly than human, as are Black people, even by those who suffer the same. Black theology must address this reality of anti-Blackness as it is fostered within our communities. This is the prophetic task of a militant love. Indeed, Black theologies in the Black church have often been prophetic in its responses to the way in which others have treated Black bodies, particularly when it comes to racial matters. What Black theologies must recognize, however, is that through the prophets, God spoke to those whom God had freed, that is, the Israelites, not the Canaanites or the Egyptians for that matter. The prophetic voice of God is an inwardly directed voice. It is the voice of Jesus calling those who would condemn and critique others to first take the log out of their own eye, and then you will clearly be able to take the speck out of your brother or sister's eye. And so it is that Black theologies must be prophetic and call the Black church and community to look inward and to take the speck of anti-Blackness out of their own eye. Put simply, Black theologies have a prophetic mission to look at the ways in which the Black faith community has fostered narratives of anti-Blackness. And again, one of the most obvious examples of this is seen in the ways in which many Black churches have abandoned Black LGBTQ bodies, and our theologies have been complicit by remaining silent at best and at worst promoting violent narratives in regard to LGBTQ bodies. It should be noted, by the way, that some of the Black youth most at risk in this country are Black LGBTQ, especially those who are trans. They are not only most at risk for suicide because no one has let them know that they are indeed sacred children of God. And in fact, our churches have said otherwise. But they have also been most at risk of violent and deadly attacks. That is why Black Lives Matters, founded by queer women, stresses the intersecting realities of racism, sexism, and hetero and trans bigotry. And racism, sexism, hetero and trans bigotry are all manifestations of an anti-Black narrative. And in as much as our churches and our theologies are sexist, hetero, and trans bigoted, then they are promoting an anti-Black narrative. Our Black theologies must actively resist anti-Black narratives of violence with, again, non-violent counter-narratives that not only call out LGBTQ systems, structures, ideologies, and theologies, and dismantle them, but they must also promote the created sanctity of LGBTQ persons and bodies and affirm the ways in which they witness to the fullness of God. Left for another time is a need for a new theological anthropology that makes the richness of God's creation, that is, makes it clear that the richness of God's creation is betrayed by any binary, gendered, sexual, or racial understanding. Bottom line, our theologies must reflect a God who is understood only through the rich diversity that is God's creation, which is not binary. That is, it's not black-white, it's not male-female, it's not hetero-homo. It is richly diverse in all of its human manifestations. For a Black theology to do any less is to not only foster violent narratives of anti-Blackness, but to also be anti-God. So, let me come to a close. In the end, our Black theologies must address the various realities of the violent narratives of anti-Blackness as they are perpetuated even within the Black church and community. It must call them out and dismantle them, no matter where they are found. In this regard, Black theologies must be engaged to stop anti-Black violence in all of its manifestations. To do anything else would mean that anti-Black violence will remain as American as cherry pie, and worse yet, crucifying narratives will remain an acceptable part of our theological landscape and our faith communities. I'll stop there. Thank you.
My goodness, thank you, Dr. Douglas, for that insightful and challenging and prophetic word that you delivered to us today. We will be gracious to our guests and give way for our Reverend Brown, our guest, to go first, after which I'll ask Joe Harris to come forward, and then after that, Dr. Harrison. So, Reverend Brown, please, yes.
We honor the Spirit of Christ because it's in Him that we live and move and have our very being. I'm thankful for the opportunity to return back to Howard and to share our convictions in the faith. The violence of, or more than skin deep, the violence of anti-Blackness and the implication of Black theological reflection. As I read and listened to your presentation, Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas, it dawned on me that since the creation of mankind, people have practiced violence as a means to promote their own agenda. I am sure that Cain didn't see himself as one committing a violent act against his brother, Abel. Cain, no doubt, saw himself as eliminating the problem. These two brothers shared the same skin, and yet it wasn't enough to stop one from killing the other. As long as there is a mindset that one must degrade another in order to experience advancement, there will always be some type of manifestation of violence. Violence is not only the fabric of American culture, but is older than the cherry that made up the pie. So I share in my thoughts that the problem is, and I share in your thoughts that the problem is more than skin deep. My concern is this: how do we break the cycle of a mindset that causes brother to kill brother and sister to kill sister? America has been sick in intensive care since the inception of Europeans running from the oppressed to a new land that they had been given only to oppress others. An oppressed people can never create anything that is healthy until they have been healed of their own oppression. Their narrative of violence has become our narrative of violence. I choose not to play the blame game, but my concern is how do we break the cycle that is destroying our communities. As you mentioned, Maryland is leading the prison population with 72% of black people in its population. Some of those black bodies in prison are my family members and church family members. We are also on track in Maryland to lead the nation in homicides this year. I have officiated and attended many of the killings of our city. I am witnessing school systems discount our children, and at the same time I'm watching our parents drop their children off at the mall but won't make sure they get to school. I raised the question in Jeremiah 8 and 22, is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no physician there? Why then is not the health of the daughters of my daughters people recovering? I was particularly moved by the quote by Lord, the master's tool will never dismantle the house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but will never enable us to bring genuine change. Unfortunately, we are trying to dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. If the tools only help black bodies to recover, then we run the risk of becoming the new master. We cannot beat the 45th president at his own game. The heart of the white supremacists thrive off of attention, so shouting at them only fuels their ignorance. We must find tools that will unite us and not divide us. We need tools that will make us healthy and tools that will make sure that we remain healthy. Point of transparency this morning, I recognize that I am not healthy. An example of this is in the past Sunday, after hearing the news that church members had been killed in Texas, the first thought that came to my mind was, were they black? Was the shooter black? When I learned that the pastor's daughter was among those who had been killed, I really want to know whether they were people of color. When I heard that they were white, I didn't feel any relief at all, because at the same time, 26 families were feeling pain that was more than skin deep. While we are still in intensive care because the shooter is being made to be a mental case and not a criminal, my heart drops again. Because I said, as CNN reported, that if it was a black body, then he would have been labeled immediately as a criminal. The tools that we must embody must create an atmosphere where Psalm 139:14 rings true for all people. I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, and my soul knoweth right well. In short, the core of rebuilding a house that is militant and governed by reconciliation and strong love, we must be militant, combative, aggressive. We must be focused on how do we make ourselves better. But before we can make that reconnection, we must recognize that there has been a disconnect. There's a great disconnect between God and God's people. Therefore, we must work on being reconnected to God. And when we are reconnected to God, then it becomes possible for us to become reconnected one to another. From the position of reconnecting to God, we will have the framework to express love one to another. This love will place us on the road to empowering not just black bodies, as important as they are, but all the people who've been created in God's image. The companion to love, according to Corinthians, is our faith and hope. We must take these three and trust that through God's power, we will be able to heal our land of its sickness. We have so many challenges to overcome, and to reach this point, we must deconstruct the violence that is in our land. But I believe that we can only do it by a leap of faith. Let me close my respondent comments by saying, I've been diagnosed with dyslexia. And one of the ways that I ingest information is by audio presentations. So Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas, I use my Apple iPhone to listen to your work. And as I listened, I heard material that didn't make sense. And at the conclusion, I decided to replay your paper. This time, I slowed the speed down, and I read along with it. I noticed that the reader wasn't reading everything that was on your paper. The reader is programmed at a certain cadence, and that cadence will break up words and sentences in order to maintain its cadence, even if it doesn't make sense. But something else happened. As I was listening and reading for the second time, my iPhone app said this: speaking feature has reached its capacity at this time. I looked at your paper that was on my phone, and I noted Dr. Douglas didn't write those words. Speaking feature has reached its capacity at this time. I said that to say this: that sometimes in our efforts to get answers, our speaking feature has met its capacity. Therefore, it must be an act of faith that as we do the work, we trust that God would change our narrative, that every life will be a life that brings glory to God. Thank you.
To the Dean and to the chairs of this convocation, and to our moderator and to Dr. Douglas, it is a pleasure and a privilege for me to represent the student body, the current student body, here at Howard University School of Divinity. It is a humbling experience for me to speak both to you and on behalf of you. So if the current student body can just stand so that they can all see you right now, if any of you that are here. Amen. Dr. Douglas has provided a convincing and compelling claim on the source of the violence and racism that African Americans consistently experience here in America. Indeed, racism and violence against African Americans is a part of America's DNA. Given this set of realities, we realize that the problem is not going away, and therefore the work is never done. So as seminarians who are traveling along this theological educational journey, we must ask ourselves, what are we going to do? What contribution will we make to continue the fight for the humanity and racial equality of African American people? The work is too important to coax through to the future on the successes of the past. Given the current political environment, even the past successes are under assault and in jeopardy of being taken away. So what will we do to continue the prophetic legacy that we have joined as a part of the original Rankin Network started here at the Howard University School of Divinity? Larry Rivers wrote, "The network's members aim to equip an African American ministerial leadership group with the theoretical and tactical foundation for an attack on Jim Crow, seeking to articulate the Christian way in race relations. Seeing that we have been grafted into this rich legacy, we have an obligation and a responsibility to continue to fight for racial equality. Not only is the work too important, but our role as future faith leaders must be taken seriously. Whatever self-aggrandizing ideas we may have started this journey with in terms of mega churches and television ministries, I hope by the time we prepare to leave these walls of Divinity School that we have replaced those ideas with ideals for social change. V.P. Franklin stated in his article, The Power to Define, African American Scholars, Activism, and Social Change, African American religious scholars and theologians provided the scholarly analysis for the religiously inspired movements for social change and laid the ideological foundation for launching nonviolent, direct action protests for Black civil rights in the United States. So I ask my fellow seminarians, are we up for the challenge? Dr. Douglas has offered up a solution to us today to end what she calls the cycle of anti-Blackness. And she states, it is defeated by a nonviolent, life-affirming force that is none other than God's resurrection of Jesus. One of the problems we will face as future faith leaders is that most people who need to hear about the resurrection power of God are not coming to church. Thus, we have to be prepared to take church to them. How do we do church in the community in such a way that we do not alienate people, but rather draw people closer into a more communal relationship? How do we do church in the community in such a way that we do not create new systems of dependency and oppression, but rather create an ethos of liberation and self-reliance? Maybe it's time we expand the context in which we do church. It will be very difficult to convince people of the resurrection power of God when everything around them is dead or dying. It's difficult, but not impossible. Larry Rivers calls the type of leadership required to provide answers to these type of moral challenges a scholar-activist minister. He used Dr. King as an example, but Dr. Douglas has advanced that argument today by lifting Jesus as an example. And she said Jesus was crucified in the first place because of his active resistance to the violent political and religious powers and structures of his time, which trap various people in violent, hence crucifying realities of living. So combining the two, you have a prophetic scholar-activist leader, one who will not only speak truth to power, but who would also speak hope to people, while at the same time actively engage in deconstructing systems that have people trapped in a cycle of violence. The people need to know that God is on their side and that God is available to them right where they are. In order to convince people that there is hope, even if he or she is living in hell, we may need to get in the midst of their hell with them, providing the type of prophetic leadership that they need. Providing this type of prophetic witness and active resistance does not come without a great cost. Has our divinity education adequately prepared us emotionally and psychologically for the type of personal sacrifice involved in being a prophetic scholar, activist leader? The prophetic tradition has always required personal sacrifice. Second Isaiah as the suffering servant, Jeremiah and his forced exile into Egypt, Daniel as a political prisoner, Dr. King's assassination, Colin Kaepernick being blackballed in the NFL, the Black Lives Matter group offering up their bodies on the front line of protests, and yes, Jesus' crucifixion. All are examples of the personal sacrifice involved in prophetic leadership. At some point between orientation and graduation, we must ask ourselves, are we ready to make the personal sacrifices necessary to be a prophetic scholar, activist, leader? Lastly, Dr. Douglas raises another critical assessment to the development of future faith leaders. She said that black theologies have a prophetic mission to look at the ways in which the black faith community has fostered narratives of anti-blackness. Dr. Douglas posited this assessment in relation to the type of exclusion and oppression that has been created in most places of worship for members of the LGBTQ, and I add I, community. Unfortunately and sadly, this is not the only type of oppressive environment that still exists in many of our faith communities. Women are still being silenced. Single parents are still being marginalized. And the kingdom-focused gospel has been replaced with a name it and claim it, get rich, feel good prosperity gimmick. The faith community must take a hard look at what type of institution it is going to be in the 21st century. Are we going to mimic the world, or are we going to model Jesus? When the Rankin Network envisioned militant reconciliation theology, it was grounded in leveraging the moral collateral of the church to combat the moral disease of race relations in America. The critical question then becomes, does the church have enough moral and ethical capital left in the bank to leverage in the fight for racial equality today? Part of what determines the worth of the moral and ethical capital of our faith communities is the theology of our faith leaders. Reverend William Lamar of Metropolitan AME remarked, "Your theology will determine who you will let in and who you will keep out, who you will let speak and who you will silence." Has our theology been informed in such a way that we are committed to providing a type of liberating faith community that affirms the humanity of all people, regardless of social location, race, gender, age, socioeconomic status, or sexual orientation? Another way that the moral and ethical capital of our faith community is valued is through the messages that we preach. The message has to do more than excite the crowd. It has to inspire a movement. Therefore, for those who do come to church, we must have a message of empowerment. I agree, Dr. Douglas, God responds in a way that negates and denounces the violence that perverts and demeans the integrity of human lives. God accomplishes this by affirming life as seen in the very resurrection of Jesus. In order to raise this level of consciousness to the awareness that God is concerned about the injustice in our society, we must preach a message of empowerment. The prophetic tradition inspired movements that led to radical dismantling of systems of injustice. So as we move through the halls, from systematic theology to Black church history to homiletics, we need to be sure that we leave this school with more than just a sermon. But we need to make sure we leave here with a message. The people that we are called to lead, they're not looking for just another sermon, but they need a message. Brian Clardy said of the prophetic legacy of seminary-trained preachers, their sermons address the social and political inequities that were prevalent in society by highlighting the supposed disconnect between the nation's highly democratic pronouncements and the reality of autocratic racism. The time has always been and will always be right now for prophetic, activist, scholar faith leaders to provide an alternative consciousness, a radical vision where the poor and marginalized imagines him or herself with the same freedoms and opportunities as the dominant culture. These are some of the questions that we should be asking ourselves as seminarians and future faith leaders. Can we bring together the academy, the church, and the community to form a winning strategy that eradicates the violence of anti-Black narratives and the resulting racism against African Americans in this country? Thank you.
And don't we just love Dr. Douglas? Amen. I don't know if you're gonna love me, but let's go. So I'd like to thank the committee for inviting me to respond, and most importantly, to respond to Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas, a Black womanist scholar, theologian of the faith, and activist ally of all human expressions of God. I call you friend, Dr. Douglas, for we are bound not only by a mutual respect, but also by a tie to a brother we both love dearly, Dr. Ron Hopson. Your steadfastness, Dr. Douglas, to scholarship, the church, and the folk are simply unwavering. In your writings, you leave no stones unturned. You meet us where we are and then ask us questions about why we are there. But most earnestly, you do that grandma thing, that Aunt Maxine thing. You move us into places of simply calling a thing a thing. And this morning you have done that. You have called the thing the thing. And honestly, as I read through your lecture, that creative side of me kept hearing beats and lyrics and prose and theological lines and beats and lyrics and prose and theoretical and theatrical lines. I wanted to shout on the airplane, "Amen, Kelly." But I figured I would have to explain to the few white folks and some of the black folks around me the nature of my exuberance, that you were doing your thing by calling their thing a thing. And they would no longer be able to mask their "leave my monuments alone, we want our country back, keep the Muslims out, put up those borders, and make America great again while I call on Jesus." They could no longer mask their desires in 4th of July cherry pie American patriotism. No, their white nationalism comes to us in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are raving white supremacist wolves. I would have to tell them and their closeted allies that we've experienced their lyrics and their songs far too long. We lived its pain, we know its tune, and that you are just simply playing it again this morning in hopes of jolting us from our spiritual comas and reviving those awakened to stay woke, to seeing xenophobia as it is, white supremacist racism. A supremacy, mind you, fueled and sustained and dependent upon what you say, quote, the narrative of anti-blackness, since the notion of white superiority rests on the idea of black inferiority. The violent nature of the anti-black narrative, you write, negates the very humanity of a people, and therefore it is inherently violent, end quote. You pull on your allies, Renee Girard and Paula Freire and Larry Rivers' article, and black folks, particularly black women's lived experiences with American Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism, to make your case of white supremacy's dependence on the anti-blackness narrative and the violent, denigrating, and dehumanizing nature of that narrative. And Dr. Douglas does this in two ways. First, she takes us back to our own being, the Howard University School of Divinity archival witness, that article written by Larry Rivers, which centers on the School of Religion's 1957 convocation and Martin Luther King Jr.'s closing convocation sermon entitled "Love Your Neighbors." Douglas notes that the 1957 convocation 60 years ago, quotes, reflected Howard School of Religion's defining theology at the time, a theology that signaled the school's mission to articulate a Christian way in race relations, as it equipped African American ministerial leadership with a theoretical and tactical foundation to attack the Jim Crow manifestations of white supremacist racism of that time, end quote. King and those Convocation leaders and Ranklin networks and allies in the struggle envision a path of nonviolence in response to white terrorism. Rivers, as with Douglass, provides the reasoning for and the contours of this call to nonviolence. This brings me to my second point. While Rivers draws on the plight of blacks prior to and during the second civil rights movement in the United States of America, Douglass draws from black experience with Europeans from the pre-colonial period to present day to help us see how white supremacy is birthed, sustained, and dependent on anti-blackness. Douglass takes us to the European gaze on black bodies prior to enslavement and black folks' inevitable and ensuing navigational experiences in Americans' terroristic minefields. Douglass guides us through the systematic and systemic attacks on black bodies by turning our gaze both outward and inward to see and feel what our forebears must have felt when the European first encountered them, an oppositional gaze, Douglass notes, of starkly difference. A difference that is more than skin deep, because it was not just based on hues, but also authoritative texts. And among them, Douglass names the Oxford English Dictionary as that authoritative text which established whiteness as all that is right with the world, and blackness as embodied unbridled sin. Just simply wrong. But I would add here, among Douglass canons, historical and historiography's texts that rendered the African, upon contact with the European, a heathen with no history, no religion, no past, and no God, which gave way to their introduction to another authoritative text and used against their black bodies, such as the Bible. For as our enslaved black scribes of the past remind us that there are more pro-slavery passages in the Bible condoning slavery than not, and the biblical mandate in Genesis, who should be enslaved, i.e. the Hamite curse, often became Europeans' weapons of choice to justify our divine and legalized position in the world. Douglass goes on to say that this is more than skin-deep difference was also evident in physical features. The thickness of our lips, the broadness of our noses, and the textures of our hair signified a genetic difference accompanied by a cultural difference in dress, customs, and religion. More importantly, Europeans articulated a character and soul difference, signifying blackness and black people as soulless, uncivilized, beastly, wild, dangerous, hyposexualized people who had more in common with apes and orangutans than humans, and black women as wild and unbridled, lacking the graces of the Victorian woman. The solution to this uncivilized beastliness resulted, as Douglass notes, and Europeans concluded the African needed to be patrolled and controlled. And drawing again here from the Bible itself and its Christian comportment, I would add here how Christianity was used to patrol and control us. You see, only one had to read Europeans' missionaries' diaries and documents of the time to see how Christian conversion on slave-owning properties in the New World was used to tame the beasts within and live a new life in Christ, a non-violent, otherworldly existence. Europeans and missionaries concluded that one could not be dangerous if one was docile. One cannot be dangerous if one is complicit. One cannot be dangerous if one accommodates. One cannot be dangerous if one assimilates to values grounded in the European gaze at the expense of their own epistemological knowing. As Jane Baldwin notes, that a dangerous black person, a dangerous Christian, is clear that they are not whites, the churches, or the Bible's Negro. Now, what Douglas goes on to say the outlining of the European's gaze was the precursor to the ongoing present-day threat against black bodies to present day. You see, to see and more importantly, to live out the practice of blackness as lewd, dangerous, immoral, substandard, sinful, cursed, and inferior, and whiteness as innocent, virtuous, intelligent, sacred, chosen, meant that black folks would be catching hell from the moment they felt Europeans' gaze on the continent of Africa to the moment they boarded that 36,000 plus slave ships that traveled across the waters, to the moment they were on those slave-owning properties which they toiled from sun up to sundown, to the moment they sharecropped lands and walked urban ghetto streets, to the moment they entered ivory towers and boardrooms, lunch counters to Selma Bridges. Today, white supremacy and anti-blackness' deadly impact, Douglas notes, is evident in the war on drugs, biased policing, black incarceration, and school-to-prison pipeline, attack on young black bodies, especially girls, poverty, and educational disparities. Anti-blackness, Douglas profoundly says, is in America's DNA. And the Trumpian wolves were merely making visible covenant, reminding people of color that their place in the world was at the bottom of the well. It was in these moments when Douglas calls a thing in the way that she does, that we can hear Grandma's hymn, Grandma's hum. Think about what she offered. Will you hum with me for a minute? Will you hum? Because if you heard her, you'd hear that hum. Sometimes that's all they had was just the hum. It is those hums that led them to their knees and pray, mind you, like Aunt V did on Queen Sugar last Wednesday, when she too could feel the resurging of that familiar song. that pain that comes with the lyrics of Black struggle. V asked God to take that thing back. Here, she said, God, take it back.
When your heart is a stranger and you know you didn't treat it right, when your love is in danger,
God, hear me.
and you know you're gonna need to fight, when you can't
Hear me real clear.
learn, when you can't learn,
Hear me real good.
when you can't learn, when you can't learn.
Whatever this is, take it back. Take it all back. Please, God, please. This. Please take it back. Please take it back. Please take it back. Please take it back. Take it back. Take it back.
Douglas takes us through our own history to remind us that the threat of whiteness is unrelenting, that the threat of whiteness is unrelenting. But here's the thing. Douglas asks us in her trickster, profound way, what are we to do about the narrative of anti-Blackness that is inherently violent, a violence that is sustained, quote, by the denigration and dehumanization of Black peoples? What are we to make of those narratives? How do we break the cycle of anti-Blackness? She asks and then provides us with two possibilities. First, she takes us to the cross, redirecting our gaze to the cross as a representation of the power that denigrates human bodies, destroys life, and preys on the most vulnerable of society. As the cross is defeated, she says, so is that power. It is defeated by a nonviolent, life-affirming force that is none other than God's resurrection of Jesus. Martin Luther King Jr. Convocation sermon rings true for us, as Douglas notes. God's resurrecting power is one that by definition respects the sacred integrity of all human bodies and sanctity of life. For Douglas, the crucifixion resurrection event is a counter-narrative to the crucifying narrative of violence. And Jesus' crucifixion arches us towards the embodiment of a non-priestly Jesus, but rather towards a revolutionary Jesus. Jesus was crucified because of his active resistance to the violent political and religious powers and structures of his time. His nonviolent approach was not passive or accommodating to violence, but rather a forceful response that protects the integrity of life, even to the point of death. Douglas helps us to see how both crucifixion, resurrection narratives and events, and Jesus as revolutionary, has implications for breaking the cycle of violence perpetuated by the narrative of anti-Blackness and white supremacy today. But here's the thing. In theory, yes. But what does this look like in practice on both sides of the anti-Blackness equation? It's clear here what it looks like from the oppositional European gaze perspective. But what about the Black Christian or religious community's gazes on its own Black body and their Black sojourner's body? Douglas helps us to see how this plays out with the LGBTQ communities, and we come to reckon with the fact that a heterosexist, patriarchal he-God simply does not work. For that God is violent. So how does this look like in practice? I say again, especially by those of us in the Christian community who have often turned away quickly from the lived realities of white supremacy, sustained and dependent on anti-Blackness, and missed the nuances here of the crucifixion, resurrection narrative event that Douglas points us to today. Instead, some of us find solace and comfort in opiate-like feeling of a leisurely walk, an easy route to stroll to the power of the cross to solve our problems, while failing to contextualize with deep forethought the events and ideologies that form the basis of our white supremacist anti-Black problem. Furthered by our weekly and Sunday morning embodiment of a priestly Jesus mindset that falters in joining Black lives, people of color causes for justice, and interrogates with rigor the interlopers of our white supremacist Black problem. We turn to the cross and its resurrection and its resurrecting power and bypass on our way to justice the events of stolen lands and enslaved people and chosen people and epistles and writings that control and regulate our very own bodies and substantiate our lived experiences, events that are found in the Bible and also in our history from slavery to present day, all before, during, and after the crucifixion of Jesus. So you cannot have it one way. You can't have one without the other. We have cherry-picked the biblical texts in our religion and our faith far too long. Our priestly, complicit, complacent rendering of the cross as a go-to when we find a problem simply does not solve it all. If you don't believe me, ask our forebears. Ask Trayvon Martin and Sandra Bland and Eric Gardner.
We stuck in La La Land. Even when we win, we gon' lose. We got the same flows. I don't know who is who. We got the same watch. She don't got time to choose. We stuck in La La Land. We got the same fools. We stuck in La La Land. Even when we win, we gon' lose. We got the same flows. I don't know who is who. We got the safe watch. She don't got time to choose. We stuck in La La Land. We got the safe fools. We stuck in La La Land.
We are, to some degree, stuck in La La Land. And I believe that this is the problem of the 21st century. Our failure to wake up from our spiritual comas, or once woke, we're unsupported by a climate of sleepers. Now, what I have offered here is not directed towards Douglas, for I believe Douglas understands, given her research and her writings, her publications, The Black Christ, Stand Your Ground, Sexuality in the Black Church, What's Faith Got to Do with It, that she gets what's driving my queries and my summations. It is her collected works that challenge us as faith leaders and religious scholars and seminary students and faculty and practitioners of the gospel to take seriously our role and the ways in which we perpetuate criminal acts against Black bodies, all in the name of Jesus. So the question is not what God is going to do, as Aunt Vi prayed so earnestly, or even what would Jesus do, but rather what are we doing? Douglas reminds us that we need not be held captive to narratives of violence as articulated, or counter narratives of violence as articulated in the crucifixion resurrection event. That there really are other narratives within our canon that we can draw from that affirms our lives and our well-being and our spirits and our Creator. And she draws from the Black Lives Matter movement. But I'm going to end with a question here as we move to all these movements that are operating in our communities, the LGBTQ activist movements, the Black Lives Matter movements. As we read these counter narratives happening all around us, what are we to make of them as practitioners of the faith, insulated in our spheres of interest, both within the church and the academy? What are we to make of these movements that come in different hues, different class stratifications, different religious contexts, different sexual and gendered identities, as they galvanize to fight white supremacist racist attacks? What will we have to say to them? And how can we hear if what we know is all that we know? Thank you.
Legacy, 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 legacy. Black excellence, you gon' let them see. Legacy, 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 legacy. Black excellency, baby, let them see.
Let's one more time thank our respondents, all three. Thank you. I know you must have many questions or comments, and I want to respect, we are at a time boundary. I want to respect the remainder of our afternoon. So with that, I want to say a special thank you to the thought-provoking, insightful, challenging, prophetic, strong talk from Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas. Thank you so much, Dr. Douglas. Thank you. And Dr. Douglas will be around, I think, for a little while this afternoon later, but she will need to go immediately after we end here. She will need to immediately get out of here, so let's please respect her time for right now. I have two quick announcements, and then we will adjourn. If you have not registered, please do so in the Holy Cross Hall foyer on the first floor. And the surveys that you were given, please pass them to the center aisle if you filled out your surveys, and they will be collected if you will just pass them to the center aisle. I think this has been a wonderful session, and it's wonderful to see all of you here. And again, a special thank you to Dr. Douglas coming down from New York in the middle of her work week to provocatively challenge us to continue to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God. I see Dr. Davis's hand. He's pointing to something to me. He's pointing to our colleague here.
Good afternoon now. I ask that you give us a little more of your time as we want to acknowledge our alumni awardees. Please be patient while we go through this process. I'm sure Jesus will bless you for it. Right? So I'm J. Paul Hines. I teach pastoral care, practical theology, psychology, religion, and all other manner of disciplines here at HUSD, and this is the great Dr. Barbara Fears, our new colleague here at Howard Divinity. I've been given a script to read, and I will be obedient and read it to the T. This year's Convocation Committee thought that as we celebrate 101 continuous years of Convocation, it would be a great idea to highlight 101 alums of HUSD who have been making a difference in the world. The criteria were set, nominations were sought, and we had a difficult task. Let me re-emphasize, a difficult task of selecting only 101 because of the tremendous work many graduates are doing in the world and the significant difference they are making. At this time, we would like to present awards in two areas: excellence in theological education and educational leadership, and excellence in justice and witness ministry leadership. The awards highlight graduates of HUSD who have either pursued degrees in academia and are transforming the world through educational leadership, or those who have taken their stands for truth, justice, and right, and are witnesses through their leadership on behalf of the poor, the dispossessed, and those on the margins. So now we will hand those awards out, and we hope those who we name are present. The first group, again, excellence in theological education and educational leadership. And if your name is called, can you please come forward? And our first awardee today will be Miss Gwendolyn Boyd. And Miss Gwendolyn Boyd, present. All right. We will have to hand that out later on. Our next awardee, Miss Audrey Bird. Audrey Bird. All right, so she gets both. All right, thank you. The next award is being given to Dr. Dolores H. Carpenter. Is she here? Dr. Carpenter? Not present. The next award goes to Eutha Hardman Cromwell. Eutha Hardman Cromwell, yes, is here. All right, next we have Miss Kanika McGee. Miss Kanika McGee. Kanika McGee is not here. I know this next person here is here, Dr. Gail Rivas. Next we have Mr. Eric Walters. All right, the next group of awardees are in the area of excellence in justice and witness ministry leadership. And the first award goes to Miss Barbara Breland. Miss Barbara Breland. Next award goes to Miss Kyra Brown. Miss Kyra Brown. The next award goes to Miss, or Mr., I'm not sure, Agorum Dyke. Mr. Agorum Dyke. Sorry, DK. Our next award goes to Mr. George Farmer. George Farmer. Not present. Our next awardee is Miss Shirley Gravely Curry. All right, next is Miss Susan Newman. Susan Newman. Is that her? Susan Newman Moore. Now married Susan Newman Moore. Make sure we get that right. Miss, Miss Serena Parks. Miss Serena Parks. She will get this later on. Miss Ella Redfield. Ella Redfield. All right, please forgive me, I'm going to mispronounce this, I'm sure. Miss Assagai Bass. Mr. Sorry. Assagai Bass. Okay, sorry. All right. Next is Mr. Melvin Green. Mr. Melvin Green. Two more. All right. Miss Barbara Williams Skinner. Barbara Williams Skinner. And last but not least, Mr. Alexander Williams. Alexander Williams, present. Well, that ends our awarding ceremony for this plenary. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for joining us for this convocation. We're running a little behind schedule, but I think we'll be able to catch up. So what I'd like to invite us to do, as we exit the chapel, if we go to the left, and we can either go around to the elevators, or if you want some exercise, go up the stairs to room 300 or room 320. We have two plenary sessions that are, we have two faculty showcases that will be one in each room. And so if you look at your programs, you could choose the one you would like to attend and go to one of these rooms. Then after that, we will reconvene in the dining room for the luncheon and another presentation and the alumni elections as well. So let's make our way up to 300 and 320 in Holy Cross Hall to the faculty showcase that you would like to attend. Thank you so much.